I have the honor to present to you Irit Rogoff, who is the keynote speaker of tonight, and I have worked with Irit Rogoff in many different contexts at the intersection of theory and practice, curating and research. We met in 2005, and since then we worked together. And I have to say, in 2005, when I met Irit Rogoff, I was just reading a text of hers on criticality, and the first sentence of the text is, "A theorist is one who has been undone by theory." And this was really, I mean, I have been undone by Irit Rogoff many times of my life. And I'm not the only one, really not. Irit Rogoff is one of the initiators of the transdisciplinary field of visual culture and founder of the department at Goldsmiths at the University of London. A really very important department that has changed the way we think about culture and about museums and about curating and about theory, and a department that will have changed this forever. Irit Rogoff has published in many different contexts. Of course, visual culture is in somehow a field that she has not only founded in Goldsmiths, but I would say the way how we understand visual culture today has been defined very much by her practice, essays like Studying Visual Culture, Looking Away, Participations in Visual Culture. And then also we discussed a lot about education and participation, where you also had a completely different angle than the one we had in the discussion before. For eFlux in 2008, you edited a journal called Education Actualized, and you turned the way how we were discussing about education in relation to museums. Since I think 2011, we worked together in a collective that is called Free Thought, that also Irit Rogoff initiated, and I'm part of it. Free Thought is a collective of, somewhere at the intersection of theory and practices, somewhere at the intersection of research and the curatorial. We have, in somehow we try to understand how the world and the relation to different practices function, and in this sense, we thought about infrastructure first, and now we think about spectral infrastructure. We have co-worked as co-curators for the Bergen Assembly in 2016, and from 2020 to 22 in Utrecht at the BAK, Basis für aktuelle Kunst, and now we are working on a book called Spectral Infrastructure. Irit Rogoff has been a teacher for many people, has founded also a PhD program that was first called Curatorial Research and now is called Advanced Practices. And together with many people working on their PhD, again, there is something going on, like a ghost, that makes a difference in our field. Yeah, so Rogoff works between academic teaching, theoretical writings, curatorial projects, and organizing public study. And I am really very happy that you came here to Dortmund. Thank you so very much for that, and for the gift of theory and of imagining with us, the museum, differently. Irit Rogoff.
So thank you for inviting me to join you. Thank you to Nora, to Joachim Bauer, and to Andrzej Zadowski for bringing me here. And before I start, I wanted to maybe situate or frame what I have to say within two particular kind of sets of conditions. One is that I come to this discussion through a recognition that we are broken, and that we are broken through, I think, two large trajectories. One has been the inability of modernity to in any way lessen the tragedy of historical colonialism and contemporary multinational imperialism, and the sort of constant turmoil that we live out through wars, famines, so-called internal terrorism, has to do with the fact that these legacies have not only diminished through what we were hoping for through the operations of modern social democracy, but actually increased. The other kind of framework, which is a starting point for me, is that I do not see the museum as an institution of representation. And I don't see the work that is done in it as the work of representation. And I don't feel that those are the correct ambitions for thinking what this can be. And what I'd like to do in what I've called my imaginary museum is I'd like to put forward another notion of what I think it can do. And I apologize both for subjecting you to English and for the fact that I am about to darken your mood. André Gide's famous project, Le Musée Imaginaire, in which he spread out photos of artworks through the ages, is a pantheon of Western iconicity, an inner landscape of all the influences that had led him up to that moment in his life as a major cultural arbiter. It represents every form of tradition that I feel hampers the museum from being what it could be. If its performative powers were actualized. The knowledges are not at work, they simply are, fossilized in their privileged safety. It is not so much Gide's ideal, but a portrait of a cultural consensus of what is valuable to preserve. My imaginary museum would lay out what a museum might be when it is not a collection of objects with numerous departments who provide the facilities to serve these up and expand their mediation and remit. This could be understood, this serving up and expanding a remit, could be understood as centrifugal movement, whose different components operate to create greater impact. Everything is drawn in to rotate around the said objects and expand their sphere of meaning. Museums, then, provide the numerous contexts for art and design objects where, when, and by whom they were made, what their historical provenance is, and how they illuminate the social history of a place or a regime or a social or professional class. How they might have broken free of the conventions, formal or otherwise, in which they were previously held. These forms of display also serve up a completed narrative, a story arc that progresses along and arrives at a conclusion. Artists making exhibitions are particularly vulnerable to this demand of setting up a completed narrative, in which they both feel the pressure to articulate the problem they're facing, as well as guide us towards its resolution. Along the way, they have illuminated a problematic or a set of conditions that can then be defined through the projection of a recognizable subject. So at the heart of, I think, what I'm trying to think through is the fact that my sense is that the articulated subjects by which we are surrounded are a decoy, that they are what prevents us from doing the work that we need to do, which is articulate subjects. That all the work that we do goes into the articulation of a subject for the work that we do. Instead, I would want to think of the potentialities of the museum when it is a circuit of relations, imaginaries, emergent communicative modes, alternative attentions that understand singularization in the experience of the visitor. If you like, a centripetal mode that draws outwards from itself while producing new social effects. And I think if I am to think of how I perceive of the museum today and of its potentialities, it is in the potential to produce new social effects. My imaginary museum would be a performative space dedicated to enabling the event of knowledge rather than the a priori demand to display objects, artifacts, or other material presences, to build contexts for them and complete narrative circuits that for visitors to follow. To unpick the above statement, I need to clarify what constitutes the experience of museum, what constituents of the experience of museums and spaces of display I am arguing against. First and foremost, I'm arguing against is the notion of contextualization, of setting the limits or the horizon of what the reach of an installation might be. When Derrida was setting up the Collège de Philosophie in Paris, he wrote, "Whether narrow or expanded, boundaries do no more than set the limits of the possible." And I think that is a mantra that I have tried to live by for much of my kind of professional activity. Of providing familiar narratives that complete a circuit and establish a degree of comfort with the subject at hand. So if we speak of migration, the narrative ensures arrival, settlement, and assimilation. If we speak of precarity, it ensures a degree of stabilization and security. If we speak of shifting sexualities, it ensures an eventual acceptance and civic or legal resolution. At heart, I am a Deleuzian. My interest varying always from the question, what is it, to the question, what does it make possible? Deleuze always argued that we do not experience culture as a series of material presences, but as a series of affects projected forwards, ever distant from their original selves. Therefore, delving into the background, into the context of something as it appears before us, does not actually broaden our understanding of how it is operating in the world right now. Culture operates as a screen on which it projects, and digging behind the scenes to figure out what might have made it the way it is, does little for us to understand its state of presence in the world. And for me, that is the museum. It's an aggregate of states of presence in the world. So the moment of encounter that I would aspire to would not be a moment of the cumulative histories of whatever is being displayed, but the moment in which it operates as a trigger for an event of knowledge. The first thing to say about the event of knowledge is that it is an aggregate of all the work being done by the curators, artists, thinkers, displayers, and everyone else involved in bringing us to this moment. But it cannot be separated back to its components and attributed to single actors. The second thing to say about the event of knowledge is that it is transformative in nature and involves a realization. But that realization is not one in which something becomes clear, is grasped and appropriated, but one in which a relation is established. My first experience of an event of knowledge took place in front of the Atlas Group work on the civil war in Lebanon when it was displayed at Documenta 11 in 2002. I, a native of the region, had only guilt and shame to navigate my way through this horror-filled period of a neighboring country in whose historical spiraling into violence and sectarianism my own country had interfered and exacerbated. The Atlas Group work, with its layers of fictionalized archive, its eccentric invention of characters acting against stereotype, opened up a space in which I could rest, could take part, could imagine together. In getting caught up in the stories of malfunctioning, of a Marxist history professor whose Achilles heel is betting on horses, and whose secret trips to Paris to indulge his vices, or of intelligence officers who, instead of fulfilling the duty by photographing potential dangers on Beirut's Corniche, spend hours photographing the sunsets that have enchanted and distracted them. Of the industrious nerds who put together archives of car engines that blew up as car bombs throughout the period of the Civil War, decimating whole neighborhoods of the city. Every project was meticulously detailed and elaborated and narrated as a confident fiction. Insisting on occupying the narrative terrain of the war with as much legitimacy as the field reports filed by foreign correspondents. Nothing here was factual, but everything here allowed me to position myself differently in relation to this conflict. No longer only shamefully guilty, I could enter the narrative and imagine the obsessive nature of the archive making, understanding that war and violence have a logic of their own and that you cannot stand outside of it. As Homi Bhabha said long ago, in every emergency, there is an emergence. Nothing I learned here added anything to my factual knowledge of this horror-filled period, but everything I saw transformed my relation to it, allowed me a relation to it. Later, when I got to know Walid Rad and his process, I understood that this was not his vision, but the accumulation of conversations with other artists and thinkers in Beirut over a long period, twisting things round and round, trying to figure out a way of inhabiting the process of living out a crisis of this magnitude. The work that I saw, the Atlas Group project that resulted from these 3-4 years of meeting every night, drinking and talking, became a living with a condition rather than a talking about it. A distilling of possible subjectivities from harrowing events and narrating them through unfamiliar tropes. What I am calling an event of knowledge was the instance in which a space opened up that could be occupied in a counterintuitive way. If you remember the opening of Peter Weiss's novel, The Aesthetics of Resistance, the 30-page conversation between the students standing in front of the Pergamon altar in the eponymous museum, this is an event of knowledge. Historical facts made to enact contemporary political drives, dragged and twisted out of context they may be, but they are also a powerful means to draw everything around one into an overriding urgency. Last week, I experienced another transformative event of knowledge. We had invited the Russian, Israeli, Belgian choreographer and performer, Arkady Zaides, to come and do a seminar with us. He showed us 3 contemporary projects in the making. One to do with footage he had found of the cleaning up squads who cleared out the Chernobyl site after its explosion, next to which Arkady had been born. These cleanup squads were plied with heroic platitudes about the gratitude of the nation and its people for their selfless sacrifice, and who never recovered from it, all of them dying of radiation exposure shortly after their cleanup activity. The collapse of his childhood history with the aftermath of a nuclear explosion and the death of the area. The relation between the state and the self-sacrificing individual refracted through ideological posturing and memories of alienation and of childhood friendships totally destabilized the notion of belonging and of having a history and a place. The mythologies of places in one's memories infused with much broader state mythologies and family narratives. The second project he showed held a fascination so grim that for some time while watching and afterwards, I had no idea what to do with what I had seen. Arkady had started working with the Archive of B'Tselem, an NGO in Israel that serves as a watchdog for the rights of and violences against the lives of Palestinians in occupied Palestine. The organization had distributed film cameras to West Bank and Gaza inhabitants and asked them to film testimonies of how they were being dealt with. These are archived and used by B'Tselem in various legal battles on behalf of human rights violations. Arkady had begun to work with the archive and devised a work in which he projects film on one wall and then performs in relation to them. He watches the body language of the brutality being enacted and then tries to distill from it a gestural code of violence, extracted out of the specific situations within the performance. The gestural language of bodies inflicting violent pain becomes one that we can establish a relation to, not a position about. The possibility of arriving at something like this through the accumulated work of a human rights NGO some brave people willing to film their own dire experience, a choreographer and performer who puts themselves in such a precarious position, a gallery who finds it possible to put on these performances, and audiences who attend these and attend to these performances are what constitutes the event of knowledge. We, the audience, had become the witness of not just those brutal events, but of our Qadi, trying to come to terms with them, trying to learn something from them, trying to extract a new form of embodiment from a series of political testimonials. The narrative is wide open, waiting to be lived out and taken full circle. There is not a stated context, but a new proximity arrived at from an oblique angle. For me, all events of knowledge are arrived at from oblique angles, never through the frontality of knowing in advance what the problem is, how to approach it, what knowledge you need to be equipped with in order to address the problem, and how to lay out your conclusions. And yet, they are also about the living out of our efforts to know, our efforts to come to terms. Can the museum practice be one of willful obliqueness? Can it give up its position of shaping narratives and subjectivities, illustrating narratives, and partaking in the project of constituting informed citizenship? It would perhaps be an abdication of its historical charter to civilize through informing and exposing. For myself, I am always more convinced when I encounter a chronicle of the efforts to know rather than the conclusions of knowing. When Achille Mbembe published his groundbreaking work, Necropolitics, he stated that within the state of current conditions in Africa, the choice was no longer the classical European distinction between life and death as the two extreme opposites of being, but rather between death and death, real death and symbolic death. A simultaneous condition of living out those conditions. As the immigrant crisis around us has deepened, we have seen this not in the statements of the philosopher, but in the unfolding of daily occurrences of drowning migrants crossing in small boats, trying to reach a safe shore. The third project of Arkady Zaides, that Arkady Zaides showed us last week, was one he once again enacted with the aid of an NGO. This time an NGO that traced immigrants who had died trying to arrive in Europe, traced their route, gave them names, and located their burial sites. The NGO researched their names and where they are buried. And Arkady, with the aid of complicated GPS technology, walked the coordinates of their location to mark the presence of their graves, filming the entire journey in search for the sites, the arrival, and the information on the grave, often claiming to be anonymous. This is followed by a forensic anatomical performance, claiming fictitiously to dig up the bodies and bring them to the performance space. At an encounter in an art space last week, Chisenhale Gallery in London, Iranian-British artist Abbas Zahedi said, "I feel like I hijack gallery spaces as spaces to grieve. What does it mean to have an audience for that grief? Having the opportunity to be witnessed in your grief, or to witness grief, serves an important social and emotional need that we have, of the strangeness and the difficulty of making art at the threshold between life and death, and of trying to find a way back from it. If the museum, the spaces of display, can serve a purpose within the current climate of hardship and despair, it is to open the possibility to enact grief. When Abbas made that statement, I realized that we can no longer grieve. We must have positions. We must locate enemies. We must perform our enraged beliefs. But we cannot be in a state of grief as a social relation amongst ourselves. The event of knowledge is a social and historical relation amongst ourselves, grounded in acknowledging the work of many who have had a part in bringing it together. Our grief is collective, and it entails hard work and effort. It entails unearthing facts and materials in order to perform an affective relation to an event. It is what takes place in my imaginary museum. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. You did what you say the museum should do. You propose to open a space that is not defined by the binaries of violence, from which you say that we actually cannot be outside in a situation in which it happens. And at the end of what you said, you also related this affective relation to what is happening with all of us, with something that I'm very interested in, the material dimension, or the dimension of excavating. Mm-hmm. How do you see this relation between the material and the affective?
Well, I think what for me has really changed regarding museums and institutions of display has been that a long time ago, let's say when Daniel Sherman and I did that book, Museum Culture, I genuinely thought that the museum was a site of critique. And I genuinely thought that that was the most beneficial way to deal with historical connections, is to produce around them a framework of critique. And I think that I have lost that certainty. And I think that what interests me now is what happens amongst us. Because, you know, in the earlier sessions, Oliver and some of the people in the audience opened up questions around participation. Well, this, for me, is participation. What we're able to produce amongst us in and around the sites of display is what I think of as participation. I no longer think participation is the ability to perform your opinions and your positions. Maybe because we have failed across the board, so maybe I'm sort of speaking from a defeated experience. But the sort of far more powerful for me now is the sort of ability to be in and to use material presences in order to extract and pull out veins of inhabiting that weren't familiar to us. I was looking at that work of Arkady Zaidis's with the B'Tselem archive, the film archive, and thinking he is not producing a gestural language of violence in order to accuse. He is producing it so that we recognize all of the echoes of it that we live out every day. And that the sort of ability to think of that as the environment is something that has become extremely important to me. So I think I think there's a kind of shift. I think I told you that I run a program in London called Advanced Practices, which is a PhD program. And at the beginning of the year, I asked everyone who came to introduce themselves through one concept, to please say the one concept that was most important to their thinking and their feeling and their work. And we went around the room, and 30 people said what. And then we got to a young woman who had just arrived from Hong Kong, and she started talking. And then she stopped and she said, no. Heartbreak. My concept is heartbreak. I am heartbroken. And she then told us that she had initiated an archive of the democracy movement in Hong Kong, most of which is now sitting in jail. And that this archive is sitting under the bed in her apartment in Hong Kong. And that the aftermath of all this was not the sense of a failure of a democracy movement, but heartbreak. And I thought heartbreak is an excellent point from which to start. This is where we can start doing our work. The sort of that notion of inhabiting a condition, finding ways of not materializing it or positioning it, but being in it, living with it, exchanging from within it rather than from outside of it, is, I think, an incredibly productive place from which to start working, in which you don't designate an inside and an outside. And I think it's the not designation of an inside and outside that has become increasingly important.
So if you want to say something or ask something, either in English or in German, it's totally fine. And because Irit and I, we used to speak a lot, and of course we could. But it would be nice also to share if you have thoughts or questions. Yeah.
Thanks. Renee Tribbles, my name. I'm not sure if I can articulate that right, but because what you just said, I think it's quite also about being inside and not outside, in the same way. And then before you said also, you told us about the moment of grieving or grief. And then you said, but we can't stand in a status of grieving. We have to position ourselves. And now I wonder, because now you said again that heartbreak is a good way to start to work as a condition. I wonder how we get to that, what you said before, not staying in the grieving, but position ourselves and getting out there. Maybe I missed that in the end of your talk, but
or maybe it wasn't very clear.
Yeah, but I thought that was quite interesting. But I felt a little bit it's also kind of telling us, or trying to tell us how we could relate or what we could do, and maybe you could get a little bit deeper into that.
I can try. I think that I responded so strongly to Jun Shen's notion of heartbreak because she didn't say, I am disappointed. She didn't say, I am defeated. She said, I am heartbroken, which to me meant that those political initiatives that she had been archiving for a year and a half were not something that happened outside of her, but something that galvanized her imagination, her ethics, and it wasn't simply what she believed, but a condition of existence. And it is this recognition that knowledge is so tightly bound within conditions of existence that it's inseparable. And that the sort of we're surrounded by work that is, and by spaces that have the capacity to propose to us to recognize how much we're inhabited by it, and secondly, how we can find ways to kind of articulate it that is experiential rather than lecturing somebody about what you believe in. So there's, you know, we are in what in English we would call a very shouty historical period, right? Everyone is shouting. I find it virtually impossible to lecture anybody about what I believe in. There's too much noise that one is competing with, too much enragement, too many opinions. But the capacity to co-inhabit a condition, I think, is there. And this is what I would really be sort of happy to see institutions do, is produce an invitation for that rather than a display. Because a display is, to my mind, increasingly like a sort of shouty conversation. So you tell somebody what you believe in. But that doesn't do anything. It doesn't work. It doesn't do any work. And I'm interested in the ways in which classrooms and museums and sort of outlets, let's call them, have the capacity to kind of produce an affective terrain that we can all inhabit. There's a museum in Oxford called the Pitt Rivers Museum. It's an ethnographic collection. It's a colonial ethnographic collection that is the estate of a British Army general called Augustus Pitt Rivers, who then gave the entire estate to Oxford University, and they set up the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I don't know how many of you had a chance to see Isaac Julian's show in Düsseldorf at the K21, but a lot of his latest work, Statues Never Dies, take place in the Pitt Rivers Museum. So I was talking to one of the curators, and they had recently spent a lot of money renovating the museum and decided not to change the display. The display is, you could call it unreconstructed. It's the original display in which vast numbers of objects are lumped together, let's say by their use, their bowls or their spoons or something. Not by any kind of context, not by researched context. Now, it's a museum full of ethnographers and they have plenty of context, but they made a decision. And I was sort of trying to find out from her what lay behind this decision. Now, she does not have the language of performance. But what she was saying was essentially the museum, in this kind of mad accumulative form of its display, essentially performs the panic that was colonialism. The kind of complete inability to cope with anything that you're facing, to know or understand anything. You know, a spoon is a spoon is a spoon. And I thought, actually, that's tremendously interesting, to have this vast ethnographic collection perform panic, perform historical panic and contemporary panic. Because there's the panic of those who accumulated all this stuff. And then there's the panic of the curators in the present moment who have to find a logic to present it in a way that is more understandable and acceptable to audiences. And in Britain, because we're a migrant society, audiences are about as diverse as they could be. So there's a kind of duty of responsibility to explain something. So their decision was to just hold on to the panic and perform it. And I thought that's precisely my understanding of hijacking the spaces of display for the performance of grief. Because you put your audience in this situation where something has to happen. They have to think. They have to locate themselves. They have to figure out a set of relations that they have with the objects, with the histories, with the administration, with the neoliberal kind of edicts that say that the museum has to be for everyone and represents everyone's opinions, etc. So all of this is happening. That's what I'm talking about. Does that make it clear? Good.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I hope I'm able to say what I want to say now. But I had a question about your definition of the moment of realization, because you said, as I heard correctly, nothing is factually, but everything allowed me to position myself to the conflict. I hope I cited that right. Mm-hmm. And I just found that very interesting, because before the break, Nora Sternfeld told us that the base for democratic argumentation are facts, which I don't think I totally agree with. So I would just like to hear you both talk a little bit about that.
You point the finger on a discussion that we have since many years, and we actually work together on this project, on this concept of the unarchivable. And maybe when we talk about the unarchivable, the relation to the archive and the relation to fact and the relation to the affective can emerge together. Do you want to start?
I'm thinking. I think it goes back to this notion of the shouty conversation, the sort of facts mobilize a particular logic that has kind of lost purchase in our world at present. And therefore, and the other thing that concerns me, and it concerns me in teaching as much as in curating and visiting museums, is that I have lost faith in the notion of correctives, of doing something to correct a previous outrage. And so the sort of shaping up logical facts and using them as a corrective, there's an expression in English or in American, which is, it just doesn't land. And that's my kind of experience, is that these efforts simply don't land. So it's not that I don't believe in facts. I do believe in facts. The question is, can one identify with a fact? Can one in some way use a fact in order to open up a certain kind of internal emotional climate? I'm not sure. So the sort of my sense at present is that what we need is the space to inhabit registers that are not factual registers. That we need this politically, and we need this in our kind of existence as humans. And that this is sort of what I'm trying to argue for. And also, I think we need a very, very different, and this is specifically to the museum, I think we need a very, very different notion of how things work in the spaces of display, of trying to understand what happens, and what produces work and what is kind of passive and just evokes reactions. And that's the other thing, is that doing work is not evoking a reaction. So these are kind of my concerns around factuality. Noah, you think differently.
Yes. Yes, I do. When I listen to you, I really think that, I hear that all your examples are based on projects of people that take a lot of time with, let's say, something that happened. And with materials or stories that relate to it. And when I want to talk about facts, then this is very much what I want to insist on. And so I don't see in the practices of what you talk about, and also in our collaborative practice, I absolutely don't see this as a contradiction. While I see a contradiction, I stand behind it, I see a contradiction in what we could say. Now, I will say it, but of course I agree with you, Irit, that when I say it, this will perform some kind of antagonism between us. That is absolutely not what we are doing, and not what we are doing since many years, and absolutely not what we are doing in relation to the material we are working with as curators and theorists since more than 15 years. So I think that now, let me maybe tell you a story as well, the way how I see Abi Warburg. We talked about that several times. Abi Warburg, for me, is a guy who is standing there trying to show to Germany of his time, with all he has, with words and pictures and materials and the space. He tries to show to people, hey, look, forms are migrating. They have been in Florence, and now they are here in Hamburg. The same form, look at it. They are not just as we said, ethnically in the earth of the north. And I can show it to you. I show it to you with all my rational means, with all my possibilities. I show you forms migrate. The answer of the other people in science, in the university, in art history, in anthropology was, no, you are a stupid, rational guy. We actually feel it. We feel it. It's there, This is the form is Nordic. And we have the actual echte relation to it. And you are looking for Wahrheit. We have Echtheit. We don't need your explanations of the facts. And I think, and somehow you are telling me, Nora, you can go like Warburg, show all the people all these factual things. It might not work. But I think it's still a work that is to be done. And the tendency of more and more Echtheit in the discussions we have is scary for me. Mm-hmm. And I want to do the work from both sides. And today I use the word Jetztzeit of Walter Benjamin. And I think it totally echoes with what you said. It's the work with the historical material that creates an actualization, or what you would call an event of knowledge, in the moment when the encounter between the historical material and me changes, flips the way how the world was defined until now. So you see, it's not a contradiction, even though there is a contradiction.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is a historic moment, Nora. Notate it, please. I think that what you call the need to dislodge Echtheit, yes, for me would be the need to insist on disjuncture. And I was looking at this, and this is something that I think is very important. That when I tried to say that the subject is never the subject, and all of our work is, has to be aimed at finding the subject, locating the subject, articulating the subject of all of this stuff that we're doing. I think that's the work of disjuncture, because what it takes is narratives and mythologies that we're familiar with. It puts them one next to the other, and it insists on a queer set of relations between them. So when I was looking at Arkady Zaidis's work on Chernobyl, so he was born just outside of Chernobyl, and still has family there. And I was looking at this and thinking, we speak about identity as if it was some kind of stable entity that is bequeathed by the state. And what I'm seeing here is somebody 3 times migrant putting next to one another a series of absolutely contradictory mythologies that could never aggregate peacefully within him, right? So it is a discussion about place and identity, but it's a discussion of place and identity in the ways in which it gets built up through narratives that are unhappy with each other. It's the art of unhappy narratives. And and that seems exceedingly important to me. And I really wish that museums did a lot more of that.
And what I think is actually what facts do is they displace identity. If you look at the material very seriously, you will realize that you find so many things that you would rather leave in the drawer. And I can only imagine that this is what most of the curators do, because most of the exhibitions don't show these contradictions and these displacements. And this is what he's doing, actually. He's leaving all these contradictions there and displacing himself, or through his displacement maybe, gives us the chance for what you call this affectivity.
Yeah. And then also how are we the carriers of all of these things? That requires a lot of thought. And it certainly doesn't require a lot of lecturing. It requires a lot of thought. The ways in which one is the carrier of all of these unhappy narratives.
Yeah, this would bring me to,
There's somebody who raised a question there.
Where?
Lunhan has a question.
Lunhan. How lovely.
Hi, thank you very much for sharing what you have shared with us. I just wanted to mention something that I got kind of like inspired by some words that you mentioned, and I want to bring to our attention about this, like the notion of spaces we give from the position of people working in cultural institutions or side of this.
To give?
Yeah, the space that we give versus the spaces that we need as cultural workers, etc. And I'm thinking about rigid restrictions, let's say from a cultural space, how much we're giving the audience or the artist or practitioners, versus when we ourselves are, let's say, in the position of a curator or an artist, the limitations of a space. So I'm giving a concrete example. An artist asked me, Linhan, I need a curator. I'm working with a museum in Switzerland. And I said, well, you don't need a curator, you need a lawyer. And I emphasized this again when we were working with the space. And I said, actually, I don't want to have this conversation like in the evening. I want to have the conversation with you. What is the space that we are given here? And actually, this was a very important conversation because it really changed over the time that we worked with the museum. And us as like people that give space for artists and cultural workers, we really need to negotiate how much space are we giving in these times of, you said, neoliberal times, and I'm thinking about capitalism and thinking about, let's say, London, the UAL, how much space they're taking, and how they're also part of the problem that people cannot pay for spaces or claim spaces where they want to share work. So I was just thinking about this being a very important, I don't know, like point in our work as well, how we are really not working democratic in a way of how much space we're giving to people who would need it, yeah. And thank you again for sharing your examples with us as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I think to a large extent, that is what the kind of my own kind of dissatisfaction with the museum as a space of representation is, because there is a kind of immediate connection in the minds of people who make art policy that if you do 10 exhibitions of Indian artists at Tate Modern in a year, then you will redress 300 years of colonial rule and the stripping of the subcontinent from all of its resources. The sort of, or you will somehow make migrant population of 3 generations feel more at home by reflecting themselves to them. This is the work of representation. And I think, no, if we actually can in some way create the space of experience as a shared space, that might actually, do some work. But the sort of the way in which institutions are absolutely kind of hijacked into this rhetoric of representation has kind of flattened. I don't know about what's happening here, but it's certainly flattened out our institutions. You want to add something, Nora? There's somebody there.
I'm coming.
Do we need to finish? Joachim, do we need to finish? Do we need to finish?
Hello, hi, my name is Ellen. I'm from Dresden Hygienemuseum. I'm doing outreach there. And thank you very much for your lecture. I still kind of resonates like one sentence or a picture you opened up about artists hijacking spaces to enable grief or to share their grief. And yeah, and then what happens when they let other people see this grief? And it's like, I feel like I'm on the tube and I want to get somewhere with this thought, and it kind of stops early. I kind of think, what happens after the grief? What happens after the co-inhabitation of a condition? Because then we just have this moment of knowledge or of feeling or of shared grief. But I wonder, what is the potential you see or in your imaginary museum, or what comes after this moment? And I just can't stop thinking about it, and I wonder what you think about it.
I mean, I can't produce a model, but I can think about the fact that that for me, what it does is it changes the address, right? So the sort of you're not addressing a problem, you're addressing those who are living out the conditions of the problem. And that feels like an enormous shift. And it also feels sort of really important to produce spaces of recognition that if somebody comes, at the heart of this particular story is the fire in Grenfell Tower, which was a building in West London that caught fire just before the pandemic, and in which over 70 people were killed in the fire. And over 200 families had to move out of the building, and they haven't been rehoused yet. And the fire was caused by cladding, and the cladding has not been outlawed yet. There are commissions upon commissions upon commissions, and it's like a festering wound in West London. And the majority of the families that were living there were migrants or refugees or asylum seekers and so on. So it really has been a kind of open wound within the topography of the city. And I think this was at the heart of what he was kind of talking about. But there's a kind of assumption that those who grieve are those who suffered directly from it. Those who grieve are those who knew somebody who suffered. That there's a kind of immediate relation. And I think that I think we're all living in a sense of a state of decay in Britain today. And I think that's what opened up when he started talking about this, started thinking about this. It's what opened up was the sort of the admission that one was part of that grief in an indirect way. That seemed really important. So I don't know what happens afterwards, but I think the narration of this one particular tragedy changes, to my mind. A relation to a city changes. And this is what I mean by work. That things have to work, they have to do something. Right? It's that Deleuzean question, what does this make possible? That's the only important question. And so that's how I'm thinking about it. Not that this precisely is going to come out and my next step will be that, and then I will make an exhibition like that. But the sort of it's inhabitation. I inhabit a particular event differently. I recognize the degree of the decay of the city kind of inhabiting me, the sort of osmotically kind of entering one's consciousness. That's what I'm thinking about.
Here I could add something or think with you about something. You know that we talked about it also already, that I am in the moment very interested in the concept of inconsolability, or how we can think museums as spaces of the inconsolable. I owe this term to Max Czolek in the German book about the Versöhnungstheater on the one hand and his demand of Untröstlichkeit, inconsolability. And for me this resonates a lot with what you say. And what Max Czolek is in somehow asking is, what would it change if the idea of memory work would be not about reconciliation, of making it good again, but about inconsolability? And I ask exactly the same question in relation to many things that we have in the moment in the museum. Like, what would it mean that the whole debates about decolonization would not be about making it good again, but about inconsolability? What would happen then? And it relates very much with what was said, because I think that the question of consequences is not something that comes up when you are sad and then you can move on. It actually comes up when you are in the inside the inconsolability.
Yeah, and I think that the condition of grieving, the condition of inconsolability, which is a term I love, I have to say, is not a passive one. It's not one that shuts you down. I think that's the confusion, is that maybe this is a passive state. But I think it's not a passive state, because what it is the moment in which another set of relations can emerge. And I think what we have to work towards all the time is alternative sets of relations emerging, so that we can connect. We can connect to things and to places and to each other in different ways through all these working environments that we're in. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. But absolutely not passive. There's somebody in the last row.
If not, I think, I said it's a gift, and it's a gift. You said it's a sad note, and I think it's very beautiful to be together on this sad note, and thank you. So,
There's somebody who wanted to ask something in the final row.
really, should we have? Okay, let's have a final round of questions and remarks.
No, thank you again for the input. I have a very short question. In your imaginary museum, do you care about the gaze, like the, let's say, typical Western or ethnicizing gaze? I was wondering, or shouldn't we care?
Well, yes, of course I care about it, but I don't see it as my responsibility to correct it. So I can't imagine what a correct gaze is. The possessive gaze is something that I think we've actually managed to work our way away from, to retreat from. So I don't have a formulation of, I read a lot of Jean-Luc Nancy, and he talks about what he calls compassion, which is the passion between us, right? Not kind of pity and sympathy or empathy that we feel for somebody else, but the passion between us. And that's how I think, what is the gaze of compassion? And how do we turn everything into scenarios of what happens between us? That's what I would say.
Okay. Then let's compassion be the final words. Thank you very much, Irit. Really.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone.